as long as you keep that, as long as it's secret, you're going to suffer for another day and another day. The moment that you come clean and you shine a light on it, it has nowhere left to hide.
A lesson that addicts have needed to learn in order to get sober, that can benefit the wider world.
But certainly things that are showing up in your children's lives and things that they're struggling with are indicators of what's happening in our lives.
If there isn't redemption for everyone, if there isn't a redemption card that we all get to play in this game, then I want out.
And that the shame is holding us back from seeking out the help that's
in many
available.
cases, unfortunately, yeah.
In many cases.
Yeah, the 3 hardest words in the English word to say.
I need your help.
Welcome to the In Search of More podcast. I am your host, Eli Nash. Join me weekly on my quest for more from myself and more from this world. We'll see you on the other side.
All right, here we are. I'm sitting here with Rabbi Schneur Kaplan.
Eli,
Welcome.
It's a pleasure.
Welcome. So I don't know if you remember, but when this thing started, whatever this thing is, we're still in search of what it is. We just know that it's more. I think you were my first phone call. I think so. Do you remember? So right after COVID started, right after COVID was made up. I'm not going to wade into this stuff.
Right.
Right after COVID, right, March of 2020, I had this idea that, which I think is probably something we've shared before, is that there's a lesson that addicts have needed to learn in order to get sober, that can benefit the wider world. So I reached out to you and I said, I'm interested in doing this discussion. A lot of people are sitting home, and we invited a few others afterwards, and it was called Let Go and Let God. Remember
Yes.
that? Yeah. So that's where this thing started.
I wasn't ready for it yet. I don't know if I'm ready for it now, but at some point you can't ignore the calling. So I show up and I say, wherever it goes, it goes. Right?
So we'll find out where this will
We have
go.
a good editing team. But you have always talked about the importance of...
We have a terrible editing team here. by the way.
Do you? Okay.
We've had segments where I said, okay, so we'll edit this thing out, that ended up going live.
All right. So, but that's also the hand of God and everything.
Yes.
The divine providence. But I know that...
and I'm not afraid to say that, because they probably won't even hear me say it. I'm not offending them because they won't even
they'll
see
cut it out. If it's about them,
No,
they'll make sure it's not in
no,
it.
find out.
The editing team will make sure to take it out. But
I'm kidding.
I
The
don't
team
want
here
to
is
go
amazing.
too fast, but I know that our meeting really is very much connected to the idea of sharing stories, because soon after we met, I don't remember what year it was, but it was many years ago, but soon after we met, you had shared your story for the first time in Miami.
Right.
That was soon after we met.
Right. And you...
Somehow I was part of that, either encouraging you, or maybe I didn't say
You spoke
anything,
there.
but I did speak there.
Yeah.
Because there wasn't, you could not find any rabbi who would
Okay, right. So let's
put their name on it.
Right.
So really our meeting had very much to do with the idea of sharing a story, and somehow you were convinced, and I don't know if it was back then or it evolved over time, but you were absolutely convinced that you had to share your story because you felt that it was very important for other people to hear, that they could perhaps find their healing, because you weren't exposing anyone, you didn't need to share it for any of those reasons, but I think you felt very, very strongly that you would become a source of inspiration for other people by sharing your story, and that's why you did it.
Right. So I'll tell you what happened. What was going on by me at that time. So in terms of meeting, your father was my Rosh Yeshiva in Montreal,
Yeah.
and we stayed connected a little bit, and he told me about the son he has down
In Fort Lauderdale.
down in Fort Lauderdale. So at some point we met, and then
I actually met him with you. My father had come to Florida, and he was going to meet with you. I had never met you before. And he said, "No, Vils kommen. You want to come with me? We're going to go meet Eli." So I said, "Oh, okay, fine." I don't know if you remember this, but before I left, my father must have said, "You guys should learn together." And I said, "Eli, we should learn together." And you looked at me like, every Chabad rabbi and his brother, "Eli, let's learn." You were like, "Yeah, sure. Reach out to me. Let's." You were probably thinking I wouldn't reach out, and I didn't for a little bit, and then I did, and that's how.
right, we started.
That's how we started our learning on our own.
Then I do remember that shortly after I entered recovery, I was over by your house for Shabbos, and we had a practice of trading books.
We did.
So you gave me a few books. I gave you a few books. And one of the books you gave me was God of Our Understanding, Shais Taub. But at the time, I had not said to you that I was in recovery. That was still something I was keeping.
Right.
tight-lipped, and it was very. The timing was perfect. The timing was perfect for that for that book, and obviously now I've gotten to know Chase well. Chase has sat where you're sitting.
Gewalt.
So.
He's incredible. I don't even know how I got that book. I can't remember what I was doing with that book. There are components of our story and my story that have not been revealed yet. But somehow that book was in my possession. And I was also keeping a lot, and perhaps still am, keeping a lot about, where I was and what I was struggling with and where I was in my life. So maybe we're jumping ahead, but I know that you were sitting at my table thinking about how I ended up here and the significance of it. And I was actually thinking the same thing from a completely different space.
Yeah, even though you were in Florida, right, in Fort Lauderdale, I don't know. There aren't too many other rabbis that I've gotten to know that I went to their house for Shabbos. If they're in my immediate community, maybe. But this was, going out to Fort Lauderdale. So anyways, we got to know each other. A friendship developed. At some point, I decided to share my story. The motivation to share my story was that I felt like I had a very unique experience. After I confronted the guy who abused me, it changed my whole perspective of people who abuse children. There was not to say they don't exist, but this guy, I dehumanized him. I turned him into a monster. But when I sat together with him and we put the past where it belongs in the past, it humanized him in some way. I was like, wow, the guy's not a monster. One of the things that happened in it was, it took me a long time, and I have a talk on YouTube called Secrets for Jewish Community Watch, where I go into the whole story of where I confronted him, if anyone's interested in that story. But when I eventually confronted him, which took 4 years, it was me, him, and a therapist, and he wasn't comfortable. It was, it took a little strong arming from JCW to get him to sit down with me. But over the course of the interaction, as I started spelling out some of the things he did, which he had blocked out, he remembered a lot, but he also blocked out a lot. He was a teenager at the time of the abuse, and it went on for several years. So there was a lot of memories, but he distorted them in some way, I think. But as I confronted him with it, either he remembered or he realized that he couldn't hide from it, and he started shaking. He had a very difficult time catching his breath, and he turned to the therapist at that point, and he said, am I a monster? Can I go back home to my kids? And I left. It was so intense that I said to the doctor, maybe you'll take care of him. I'll step outside.
Right.
So I stepped out for about a half hour while the therapist calmed him down. And the thought that was going through my head was, a monster would never ask that question. A monster would never care. Like a true racist would not be offended by calling them a racist.
You confronted them, right?
If you told Hitler he's a racist, he's like, oh, thank you so much for recognizing my whole, right? Like, this is a foundational belief. Yeah, I think everyone should be. There's a racist.
Or at the least to deny it.
In this case, right, but to be worried about it, meaning the question came from somewhere so deep inside him. He was shaking. He couldn't breathe. There was a physiological response that he couldn't manufacture. Not even a very good actor could do this. He literally could not catch his breath. And the question that finally emerged after struggling for 45 seconds or a minute was, am I a monster? Can I go back home to my kids? Like, obviously not, right? Obviously he's not a monster. Obviously the answer is no. So that kind of shifted something. And I felt like I had a very unique experience, one that probably most people never get to reconcile with the person who sexually abused them, most people who are sexually abused. And I just thought I tasted a piece of cake of life that almost no one's ever tasted before, and I just had to share it. And that's where it wasn't even so much helping people. It was kind of the same thing that encouraged me to get in the ice bath before we started this. I was like,
yes, by the way, we did just get into an ice bath, or did just come out of an ice bath.
Right.
But very interesting that you had shared something publicly, and you had shared it with me, and it's something that I have repeated a number of times. I was somewhat involved with JCW at that point because of you, and of course that event was hosted by JCW, and they facilitated your meeting. But what was interesting, you did not feel that the name of your abuser should be on that wall. And a number of people confronted you about that, because on the one hand, you're supporting JCW, and one of the things that they were doing in order to protect potentially other children, other victims from monsters that are still out there, was to put people on the wall of shame, to give them the opportunity to come clean, to give them the opportunity to get the proper help. But if not, you expose them. And you had said that because of your interaction with your abuser, you said there was no need to put him on the wall because you really believed that he was no longer a threat because of what you had experienced with him. So I remember that, and that was, incredibly powerful as well.
Well, I think in those, there were very few people who were exposed by JCW, very few. There were a number of people who were put on the wall of shame who were arrested, and then we shared that information, so maybe it wouldn't have been known in Israel that some guy was arrested in a little town in New Jersey. So some of that was exposing, information, making it more relevant, sharing it with relevant communities. But there were very few people who JCW actually exposed for the first time. And without going into all the detail, because it wouldn't be appropriate on what went into those things and how those decisions came about, certainly they were never made by one person, either Mayor Seawald or me. That wasn't the way decisions were made. But I didn't even volunteer for this to be the case, because it's not about punishing anyone. We're not in a place it's not our job to hand out punishments. It was simply if there's the risk that someone would go out and reoffend, but not a risk. Everyone is somewhat of a risk. Right? How do we know? But there's like an active danger kind of risk. How can you not expose it? So in this case, he did everything I'd asked. And then there were also people which knew it wasn't 100% protected. His family knew, his wife knew, his boss knew, his rabbi knew. So there was enough there that if there were enough people around him which knew that if there was something going on, it could have been repeated. They had they cared to, there would have been enough smoke for them to do something with it. So it wasn't 000. No one found out about it, but it definitely didn't. In my case, didn't need to be. But there's another thing also, is that he was a teenager when he abused me, and I think there is a difference between a teenager who abuses a child and an adult who abuses a child. From the child's experience, it's the same. Like, what's the difference who's on the other end of a rocket that hit someone? Right. No difference. It could have been a grown man, or it could have been a teenager who didn't know what he was doing. It's still the same, right? The pain is the same. But from that person's perspective, it's likely that a teenager was going through a phase and now is not in that place. Whereas if someone was in their 30s, it's unlikely that a 30-year-old was going through a phase.
Right. Chances are they're still doing it.
Yeah, and maybe this is an opportunity to share a message, because it's come up for me. A few different people have reached out to me in the last several months about this, is that they as children touched a sibling or a cousin or something like that. And they're wondering today, like, are they a monster? Are they a terrible person? And what I've heard people really struggling, racked by guilt, 10-year-old boy who touched his 6-year-old sister. So, sometimes sometimes females who touched a younger brother or a younger cousin or younger sister. I'm thinking of a few examples, and just feeling horrible, like racked with guilt and shame today. And the message that I gave to them is, as far as what was done as a child says very little about who you are today as a person. I'm 11, 12 years old. Which other wrong would you hold so?
Right.
If you beat someone up in school, would you be like, oh my goodness, I'm such a terrible person? So most likely, if someone is feeling that way, they're just absorbing a general message of sexual shame. That, shame around sexuality in a very heightened way that we wouldn't say the same about anything else. That being said, it's not a pass. It's not a free pass. What I say is that the fact of the matter is there's probably someone sitting there struggling today, right? Whoever was on the other end of that, like in my case, I was struggling. And as an adult, this little prison that I was in order for me to get out of it, either I had to break out of it, or this guy who abused me could just open the door and I can walk out peacefully. So it's kind of insensitive if he can help me out in that way. Then as an adult, it's more than insensitive. It's insensitive. It's inconsiderate that him as an adult would not do that for me. Like, why do I have to work for 5 years, 10 years in really difficult therapy to get out the door when all you have to do is sit with me and you can resolve so much? Now the door's open and now I can walk right out of prison. So that's what I usually share with people is don't beat yourself up for what was done as a kid. It's not a...
I know from speaking to clinicians about this particular issue, people who had acted out when they were younger, whether it was with siblings or with others and so on, and today they're carrying a lot of that guilt. And remember that many of us, I'm talking about you and I, who grew up in frum, observant, Hasidic communities, and there are taboos about sexuality, there are taboos about your own sexuality, there are taboos about expressing masturbation and so on. So there's a lot of added layers of guilt and shame that are associated with it. But I know from a clinician's perspective, it is, I don't know what the statistics are and so on, but it is perfectly natural for children during adolescence to experiment. And oftentimes they will experiment with what's most accessible to them. It could be a sibling or a cousin or friends and so on. And that doesn't necessarily, it's like, people who, a same-sex interaction doesn't mean that you're gay or
Correct.
lesbian. You're just exploring stuff. You're learning your own, sexuality. So there's, that component of it. But also, just to add a little something to what you're sharing, you said, had he reached out to you sooner or you reaching out to
I don't think,
abuser,
actually, I don't think he
Yeah.
should have reached out to me. I think it would be inappropriate to
For him
reach
to
out
do
to
that.
someone because maybe it's a
I
memory.
think about the conditions of the fourth step. So I think about somebody, for example, years later who's carrying some of the shame, some of the guilt of something that he did. Now,
You mean the eighth step? The eighth step.
I'm talking about making amends.
Right. So step
Yeah.
8.
So, but the question becomes, let's say, if I, acted out with someone and it's years later, right? And we were children. And I don't know where that person is. I don't know if they've blocked it out. I don't know.
It would be
what
inappropriate to reach out.
Right. It would be inappropriate. you're
Correct.
saying.
Yes,
Right.
but that wasn't the case. I was chasing this guy down for 4
Right,
years.
right. No, so I understand
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
but I'm only asking because you mentioned the idea that people don't have to carry that kind of shame and guilt, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have license to reach out
No,
to someone. You need to do this.
No, I'm
in
glad
a,
you clarified.
you
No,
know,
they
controlled
shouldn't reach out.
setting. They should talk to a therapist about it, and it should be done very delicately.
they probably should not reach out.
Right? They shouldn't reach
They
out
shouldn't reach out.
Right.
It's more of the other way. If the person reaches out
to them. They should
to
respond.
them, then respond.
Right.
And sometimes you can do things on a, like in the 12 steps. What does it say? Step 8, made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. Right? So first, step 8 sits there and says, I am willing to make right by all the people in my life. So in that step, one would imagine, let's say, right, prepare themselves to be fully willing to
Come clean.
come clean. Step 9 says, made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. So step 9, we say, step 8 is the willingness to, which is an actual step, otherwise it wouldn't be a step.
Right.
Right? So it's actual something that's being done. And step 9 is saying, where it's not going to injure them or others, then go make it directly. Otherwise, make it indirectly.
Right.
So
You were willing to do it. That's already a whole step.
exactly.
Whether you have to go out and do it, there are certain conditions.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, and I can, there was one person that I made a indirect amends to, right? Where what I did was I wrote a letter, I read it to my sponsor, and my sponsor encouraged me to burn it. And this was an amends to someone I had dated, but now we're both married, and it would be completely inappropriate
Right.
for me to reach out to her.
But you still had to
I
be
didn't say, hey, I
ready
was a
to
little
make
bit-
amends and do something
I did it.
which your sponsor had you do.
Right, which I did.
As
and
if
I
you
went through the
confronted
steps.
them, yeah.
And I apologized that I was, I wasn't faithful during our when we were dating. I hurt her in many ways. I wasn't,
Right.
I wasn't of sound mind. Right?
So in other words, what you're sharing for people.
But I'll tell you what
Yeah.
happened there. I made an amends for something that had happened 15 years earlier. 15 years earlier, I did this with my sponsor. I can't tell you how it happened. I can't tell you why. I can't tell you if it's a freak accident. Within less than a month, this woman's husband called me and said, I have a strange request for you. My wife wants to know if you'd be willing to sit down with her.
Wow.
True story.
Unsolicited, nothing.
From nowhere. From nowhere. and comes and asks me this question, and I made this amends. I mean, like, there were 15 years that had passed. So did something happen, right? For people who think I'm crazy, sharing something like this, understand I'm wearing one of these things, right? And we're doing a lot of different stuff because we believe that our actions have some sort of spiritual or energetic pulse to it. There's a difference between the kind of food we eat. There's a different, that the things we do here affect something somewhere else where we can't touch and see.
There's no question.
And this I experienced. Right?
It's like the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, writes in the beginning of Likutei Diborim in the first section, the idea of machshava ma'elas, that thinking about someone actually has incredible power. You can move things or people just
by thinking about them,
by intention.
Yeah. So this was that.
So
this was even more than just
you got a gift.
More just intention.
You got a gift.
Right. So that's the message I would send to someone: is if they did something as a child, like don't beat yourself up over it. The same thing you said. These same-sex interactions as a child. Say nothing about someone's sexuality, and a lot of people go back. It's only for sex that we'll do these things, but they go back and they say like.
Not
oh my goodness, am I?
Not for the Lashon Hara we spoke.
Right. There were a lot of stupid things we did as children. Like, okay, so this one, like, don't kill yourself up. Don't kill yourself over it. The amount of people who did this are plentiful, and people you may look up to and respect. There are many, many people who've had interactions as children, right? That, are what they are. And it could be there was someone hurt on the other side. But the other person isn't going to sit there wondering if they're a bad person for the rest of their life. That being said, going through these steps, whether it's writing a letter or becoming willing to correct it, or once they reach out and say, hey, I'm here, I'm willing, I'm able, and how can I make it right?
That's certainly, if somebody reaches out and they felt like they were the victim in an interaction, because often it's difficult to tell with children if there is really a perpetrator and a victim, but if somebody reaches out and they are opening themselves up, they want to heal or they want reconciliation, that's...
Right. A rule of thumb that I've seen is a 5-year age difference. Otherwise it could be normal exploration. Obviously, my case was a little bit different. It wasn't so much about child or not. There was a lot of physical violence attached to it as well, right? Where he locked me in a room. I wasn't able to get out. He would pin me to the bed. So there was things that had nothing to do with age, really. There was a physical and violent. There was nothing exploration about this. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. He had me trapped under him. So multiple times, he would trick me in different ways and fool me in different ways. But yeah, so maybe it's a little bit different in that way. And age is not as much of a component. But what we're talking about is not 2 8-year-olds exploring. What you're talking about is a 13-year-old and an 8-year-old, 11-year-old and a 6-year-old. That's the rule. I think is 5 years. But that rule is more for the person who's on the other end of it than who was abused versus the abuser. But that being said, sometimes our relationship dynamics that have nothing to do with age, right? But there's a power dynamic for whatever reason, whether in the workplace, a boss and employee. It's not an age
again
difference.
Becomes more devastating for the person on the receiving end. For the victim, it becomes more devastating if there's a power component.
There always is.
Yeah.
Right. There could be the physical power of the 5 years,
right,
or there could be overpowered by force, I don't know, with the use of a weapon, or just happens to be physically stronger or something else.
Or a caretaker, somebody that they're trusting and so on. Yeah. It's interesting that we're actually...
diving into this.
We're diving into this because we could go in so many different directions and somehow... And I was just, as I'm sitting here, I'm reflecting a little bit. I know there are many, many conversations that are going on in many different spaces, but especially in our community, which I'm very grateful for. And I know you are. You certainly have been the impetus for many of those conversations that have been taboo for a long time. So we are, certainly there's a greater degree of openness and willingness to share. And, we're trying to do whatever we can to help people who are suffering, and certainly to be able to protect our children who are still growing up from ever being abused. Mm-hmm. But somehow I think that conversations evolve all the time, and it's very hard to keep people's attention on something. So the nature of these conversations are, we talk about this subject for a while, and everybody talks about it, and then we move on and we talk about something else. So I know, the latest conversations have been about new things, but I feel like we haven't talked about this in a while. So there was a period of time where the idea of, child sexual abuse we were talking about it a lot, and there was tremendous awareness. And I know that many changes were, my son, my youngest, just went to camp, and I know that as a result of these conversations, yours and others, there are new protocols at the summer camps, and I believe that the the administration themselves have a greater awareness, and I would imagine that today, they would act very, very swiftly if something would come up. But I do feel like, the conversation has been, we moved on from it, and just reality is that it must still be going on.
I've seen recent mishandling of cases.
Yeah.
Even with everything going on and all the noise, it's in the abstract. We know exactly what to do. When it's presented before us, like everything gets confusing.
Right. We start to worry about, offending people or exposing
Correct.
people and their families, and
Yeah,
there's
and
a
I'm
lot of
not-
sympathy that somehow falls on, for the perpetrator rather than the victim.
Right. One of the things I remember once sitting with the director of one of the larger Chabad schools, or the dean director, and I was talking about a teacher that they had no longer worked in the school, but there were multiple allegations, and eventually the dean said to me, listen, we did the best we could with this situation. We try to be better now. I was challenging him on some of the ways that I thought he wasn't being better now. This conversation is going back about 10 years. And he said, but I want you to know that even then, we didn't know so much, but as soon as we heard the allegations, at the end of that school year, he was gone. So I said to him, and this is kind of the point, I said, so the allegation, which was more than an allegation, was that he was touching and kissing a child, right, in a classroom, and he was caught with this. But there were many allegations before. So there was a male teacher with a young boy, who he was touching, kissing, etc. I said, just imagine that it was two teachers, okay, who were caught feeling each other up and kissing each other. Both of them would be immediately suspended, right? So the only reason this teacher wasn't was because there wasn't an adult
So they
that he was
waited
doing it to
until
a
the end
child.
of the year.
So somehow, like you're saying, like the misplay sympathy, if there were two adults doing the same thing, two willing adults, both would have been expelled immediately. Like, we have no tolerance for gay teachers
Right.
in our school, get out. But somehow a teacher abusing a child just because it was, an 8-year-old and not a 38-year-old, somehow they got all confused on what to do. And we got rid of him at the end of the year. I'm like, okay, so we understand what's confusing them. But obviously those stories are a long time ago. And like you said, there has been a lot of awareness and advancement. At the same point in time, I know of recent stories that have confounded and confused schools, school administrators, parents.
Are
cetera.
there, I don't know if JCW is still functioning or fully functioning. I know there were some changes and so on, and I haven't really kept up with it in many years. But are there still organizations that are out there, at least to, part of JCW, as I understood it, was, for somebody who was perhaps struggling about acting out, to know that there would be consequences,
Right.
Is the,
There-
are we
there's
doing,
definitely
are we
no
doing
one.
enough of that?
There's definitely no one doing it in that way.
Right.
It seems to me like the community has moved towards a place of today is okay. If there's an issue, we'll definitely call the cops, but not before their investigation. Right? People forget what the cops are being called for. Cops are called to investigate. Cops don't have the authority to judge anyone.
Right.
Right? Like, they catch someone in active crime, and even then, all they can do is apprehend them, and then they go before a judge. Right? So, oftentimes when there's a story, so, well, we're not sure if it really happens. We don't know if to call the cops. Well, that's actually not when you call them.
Right.
That's what let them investigate. There's enough smoke here. You have two kids which told you a teacher touched them. Kids don't usually lie about this stuff. And there's, enough smoke around this that the teacher admitted to tickling, not touching. Right? There's something. Yeah, okay, let's bring him in and let's ask questions. So that's one thing I found. And then there's this. The main thing that changed is, okay, sexually abuse affects people, so we'll help them get therapy. So that seems to be where most organizations in the Jewish community around the sexual abuse conversation say, let's help the victims get therapy. So we're definitely missing still the iron fist, which wasn't needed often, actually. It wasn't. Usually, I do it all the time now, where people who were sexually abused reach out to me, and I said, maybe I can offer them the same gift, and I'll see if I can reconcile with their abuser, and I'll have a nice conversation. I said, I'm not a hammer. I'm not here to. I don't have a wall of shame behind me. I hated that name anyway, but I don't have a wall of shame behind me. I'm not. It's not my business. I just think it would be cool, assuming you're a decent guy, which maybe you are, even though something happened. Because I was abused by a guy who I don't feel is a non-decent guy today. So I'm going to assume going into this conversation that something happened as a child. I've only ever got involved with those cases. Something happened as a child between you and this other guy, and I want to bring reconciliation for you and for him. And I've had 5 or 6 of those that have gone.
So maybe part of the reason why we're sitting today is because somebody will listen to this podcast or watch it, and perhaps they'll reach out to you. And that's worth everything in the world, right?
Right. My time is like since the podcast that people reach out. I saw you on a podcast. I want to talk. My reason for doing the podcast was so that I don't have to give the message to one at a time. That's one of the reasons. But yeah, occasionally it happens that I feel.
Or at least for somebody to know that there is an opportunity to do that. I think what you're sharing as well is that oftentimes, as a victim, maybe we would imagine that we would never be able to find that reconciliation or that healing with the perpetrator. So that's also giving victims hope.
Right. My overall message around this topic today is really around reducing shame on all sides of it. Like, shame is a very powerful tool and should be used very, 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 very carefully. Just to assume that just because a child was abused, that there was someone that's worthy of being shamed for sure. We don't know the context. We don't know the story. Was the kid 11 and he was 6? We don't. Where are they today in their life? Were they abused also? Was something going on at the same time? It's not an excuse for them. What I'm saying is that it's not necessarily warranting of shame. Public shaming is a tool that's used. It's almost like the highest level of
in extreme cases.
In very, very, very extreme cases, and it's so dangerous, public shaming, not only for them but to bring shame to the overall conversation. Because imagine, before there's an action, there's a thought, right? So, are you going to kill someone for being attracted to children? Even the term pedophile is an inappropriate term. Why are you putting someone down? They have an attraction that all it means is that they have an attraction to children. Okay, so let them go work in it. Why do they have to? They didn't choose it. They didn't get a menu and say, I want to be attracted to, to these things. I can't imagine that. It's unfortunate that they ended up with that attraction. So what would you want? What would be the healthiest thing for them is to feel comfortable
enough to go and get help.
Get help, exactly.
Yeah.
So
and
reducing
the more shame, the less
exactly the
chance
less likely
that they're going to go and get help.
Exactly. And then what if they don't get help? What are they going to end up doing? Abusing children. So we think we help by adding shame. We've actually hurt, And as I hurt, we've actually contributed in some way to a child being abused. So in most cases, the answer is reducing shame and to use that tool very, very, very precisely. Because even when it's used correctly, there's a consequence on the other end of someone sitting there and saying, "Why I get help?" There is a organization, I think it's called like Verbhead or something, Verbhead or Virtuous Pedophile, and it's a group and a support group, from my understanding. They'll only work with people who've never touched a child. But if they're dealing with the attraction and struggling with it, and it could be very powerful, right, for some people. And some people have shared that. There was one guy I remember who Mayor Seawold confronted, and he admitted that he had abused children, and he said it's as if a demon took over me. That's the way he described it. And he's like, every time it happened, it was as if a demon took over me and used my body to do what it wanted me to do. And the way Mary repeated the story to me is he said, I understand and I feel bad, but how do I know a demon doesn't take over you tomorrow? So meaning that there is something, right? So someone was risking his life and his career and everything else when he went to do that. There's a powerful force
that's driving him.
That's driving and giving people the best tools, which is an environment with much less shame around sex, to now go and hopefully.
That was another one of the books that were exchanged early on.
Which one?
Which one of hers? I'm not sure.
Oh, Brene Brown. Yes.
Yeah. And I know that was a very powerful moment in your journey. when you discovered her, that was a very powerful moment for you.
Yeah, I mean, she put a lot of words to, I guess, a lot of what emerged from the years of work, which, this is an expression of that, which is how dangerous shame is. Her work and John Bradshaw's work, those two had the strongest impact on me with shame, and how many of us are walking around with such toxic levels of shame. And that's really at our core, like, that's what's ailing us. And if we can relieve ourselves of the toxic shame, then, what's possible is...
Right. And that the shame is holding us back from seeking out the help that's
in many
available.
cases, unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah. In many, many cases.
Yeah, the 3 hardest words in the English word to say.
I need your help.
I need help, yeah. I need help. Yeah, it's hard. It's freaking hard. An old sponsor of mine called it the 1,000-pound phone. When you're in the room, and even when you've sat in the meetings and
You
everything
got to pick
else,
it up and ask.
in that moment when you're struggling with the trigger, can you pick it up and ask?
Yeah.
And ask for help. Yeah, I think there's definitely importance on these conversations. But right now, so much of my message, like, really, really, really is around that. Someone said, "What's your podcast about?" I said, "It's giving permission to humans to embrace the fact that they're having a human experience. Even shame is a very human emotion.
It is. It certainly is.
I don't think anything else can
certainly
experience
is.
shame. Do animals experience shame? I don't know.
I can't imagine that they do. I don't know.
All humans do.
All humans do.
All humans do. And at its most toxic level, it's I think what sits underneath all of our issues, whether it's addiction, whether it's...
You internalize that shame.
Yeah, it becomes the...
It's not I'm ashamed of what I've done. It becomes that toxic shame that Brené Brown talks about.
Yeah. I like the way Brené defines it, because she's so interesting that she defines these words. No one even would think to define a word like shame. What is shame? Shame is shame. What more is there to say? But she says, shame is the fear of not being worthy of connection. So that we understand why it's so toxic, because connection is so important to us. So if we fear that we're not worthy of it, specifically because of, fill in the blank of what's causing that person to feel ashamed.
It's like what they say about Elisha ben Avuya, that Acher, they called him Acher.
Mm-hmm.
But they say that his greatest sin was that he didn't believe that there was any redemption for him.
Oh, got it.
So that's kind of the idea. He didn't believe that he was worthy of connection.
Right.
Because he did hear a voice that came out of the Holy of Holies that basically said that there is a path of return and recovery for everyone except for Acher. And the fact that he didn't protest. So that's kind of the idea. He didn't think he was worthy of connection anymore. God doesn't want me anymore.
Right.
So he didn't bother.
Yeah, I have an early podcast where I quoted, Chaim Cohn.
Yeah.
Yeah, he had a podcast going for a little bit. I'm not sure if he still does. But he once said, it was in a group, and he said, if it's something to the effect of, if there isn't redemption for everyone, if there isn't a redemption card that we all get to play in this game, then I want out. Like some of us have done very, very difficult and horrible things. And all of us have hurt someone really badly, all of us. And it's a child, a spouse, a sibling, a parent. We've all hurt someone really badly. And to be able to come to terms with that in some way and say we're still worthy of connection. We're still worthy of this this experience.
And I think that Chassidus helps us, because it helps us to distinguish between the action or the act and the person. Or if you get a little bit more involved, you have the good part of self, the divine part of self, and then the animal self.
The Tanya, the original IFS.
Yeah, exactly. The IFS. That's.
It says it. What's the word? It talks a lot about that in Tanya, that marshcher, right? Marshcher is more depression.
Atzvus and marshcher, yeah, melancholy and depression.
Right,
chapters 26, 27.
And oftentimes specifically because of a sin.
Yes.
Yeah. One of the I've told this to every single one of my sponsees multiple times. So even the ones who are not Jewish. So that and before Shema, there's a prayer. And in that prayer, it says, "V'haser Satan milfanenu u'machrenu."
Yeah.
So you've heard the.
I haven't
the
heard.
translation.
I'm getting ready to hear it now.
So apparently, some Hasidic master, which
Yeah.
is like, what do you mean the Satan? Is it two Satans, one before and one after? Like, what are you saying to remove the Satan from before and the Satan from behind? So he said the Satan. He said it's one Satan, but he works in two ways. One is temptation, and the other is guilt. So temptation, right? They go do X, Y, and Z. Go do. Then you do it, and he says, you're a terrible person. He says the first one is very, very easy for us to deal with. We know how to deal with that one. He said it's the second one that gets most people.
And that's what the Alter Rebbe addresses in Tanya, that basically the Satan or the Yetzer Hara comes to you the morning after. So he's the one who schlepped you out to begin with.
Right.
Come, let's go party. Let's get into trouble. And the next morning he stands over and he says, "What's wrong with you?" And you're thinking, you're so confused. But part of what the Alter Rebbe is talking about in Tanya, and this is the Baal Shem Tov, there are many, many sources for this. But the idea that you get the message that don't even bother to try and get up or dust yourself off, because now you're certainly not worthy of it.
Exactly.
And so that keeps you stuck.
That's a shame.
And of course, in addiction, we have that cycle of insanity, and so you act out because it's too painful
terrible
to sit with those feelings. So you act out for some temporary relief, and then you end up with more shame and more guilt, and then you act out again, and that. It's very hard to break free of that. That's why he's talking about the Satan me'acharenu is more difficult
much more
to
difficult
deal with.
Yeah, and they get us for longer. Is it safe to say that anytime someone is experiencing this level of guilt and shame, it's coming from an unholy place?
If you study well, the Alter Rebbe goes through different kinds of melancholy and depression and where they might be coming from, but it can be coming from a good place. It also depends, like the Alter Rebbe says, it depends when it's coming. If it's during productive time, so you realize that this is a voice that's trying to disturb your progress, then you know it's coming from the wrong place. There are moments where a person should set aside time to do, the personal, the reflection, the introspection. So that it would be appropriate at that point.
Oh, understood.
You want to encourage people to be able to move on. This doesn't define the rest of your life. Don't internalize that shame, but you also have to
work through it, right?
You got to work through it, but it has to be done in the appropriate setting at the appropriate time. So that's how the Alter Rebbe sort of distinguishes it.
Right, it's a good way to. I like that way, because you're saying if you're proactively entering this state and saying, okay, for the next half hour, you have, let's say, a 4-step inventory. Okay, you want to go through a 4-step inventory.
That is very appropriate.
Or the 10-step inventory on a daily basis. Okay, so we're going to spend a few minutes. I want to go into any wrongdoings and feel the pain from it. But if you're going about your day and the same feeling is coming, it's 100%. 100% coming from
the Alter Rebbe says
place.
even if it's about spiritual matters. So in other words, you missed you missed your tefillin yesterday, and now it's coming up during your productive hours. That's the Yetzer Hara trying to disturb you. That's the Satan, me'acharenu,
right,
who's trying to convince you that come on, let's not fool anybody here. Today you're going to make out like you're some tzaddik. Remember what we did yesterday?
Right.
So at that moment, it's inappropriate. But, by in the Chassidic tradition, so we have Kriya Shema Shalamita, not only to say the Shema before we go to bed, but to actually use that time as, we call it Cheshbon HaNefesh, but you want to do a thorough review of your day, keep your side of the street clean, don't carry things over from one day to the next. So that would be an appropriate time to say, okay, I'm in a safe space right now because it's not going to disturb my progress. And it's something I need to work through. Sure. Because I can't let it sit. You let things sit, as you know very well.
100%.
You let things sit, they're going to fester. They'll come up in different ways, in different places. So
it's okay, and go there, go into the fear. It's okay to be
there.
disappointed. It's okay to be disappointed in oneself. It's okay.
And if somebody needs the help, if we're talking about something not, something that happens day to day, but if it's something more serious or devastating, so then you need somebody to be there with you. Maybe it's a therapist or a coach or someone to help you through it.
Right. What you're saying is very important. First of all, before I go to that, in terms of a therapist or someone to help us through it, one of the reasons I found that's so important is because that's what combats the shame. Because the shame is afraid of connection. So using this same infraction as a tool for connection is what's so powerful. that's why I find meetings so powerful, is because some of the most important relationship in one's life is formed in a place that they once felt was so shameful that they wouldn't be worthy of connection, and here they are flipping it on its head, and connection is formed around this same thing. You know, I was once they would call fellowship, right? You go after a meeting, go, let's say, grab pizza or something else,
Or you stand in the parking lot and smoke cigarettes.
right, sometimes that.
and
But
schmooze.
fellowship is
Yeah.
we're going out, so we all went out for pizza, and you know, you can imagine meetings, right? Rich people, poor people, old people, young people, different nationalities, dressed formally, dressed informally. I mean, just like you know, we're probably 12 to 14 of us there, and the waitress asked one of us something like, "How do you guys know each other?" Right.
Good
So,
question.
right? But that bond, like, what is that bond? Oh, we all drank way too much alcohol. We all watched way
Right.
too much porn, right?
But that is very powerful, and it's the experience that people have once they enter the room,
Yeah,
and you realize, you know, for all my life I've been thinking that, you know, I must be, you know, you talk about monsters, right?
right.
I'm just the worst person in the world, if anybody would ever know, right?
Right.
And then suddenly you walk into a room and you hear similar stories, and you realize, hey, there
Wow.
are others that are struggling in the same way, or variations of the same way, and that's incredibly. Is it liberating? It's empowering, and that's what people discover in that room.
It's incredibly connecting.
Yeah, well, that's and we have it in the Chassidic brotherhood as well. The idea of talking and sharing with another person. You know, the expression that I'm sure you've heard before, but when you share with another person, so it's two divine souls
Right.
against one animal soul,
Mhm.
because the other animal soul is sitting out. I'm not interested in helping anybody else.
Right.
So that formula does work, and it does help a lot, you know, with the shame. I just feel like people have the experience growing up in our community where they felt that the environment sort of, you know, let me see how I'm going to say this, but, you know, the spiritual mentors were not willing to be vulnerable with us. And so they projected this, you know, almost perfect ascetic persona, which wasn't real. And
Wasn't
so
real.
we, who were trying to receive from them and feel comfortable with them, couldn't feel comfortable with them, because I was human, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm probably not worthy, or I would never want to share with them. And I think that over time, more of the spiritual mentors have been willing to be a little bit more honest about their own humanity. And so that really helps, because it allows those who are under their tutelage to feel comfortable enough to reach out to them.
Right.
You know, dispel some of the shame that you're. Well,
100%.
you know, again, the spiritual mentors are also dealing with their own shame about being human. You know, but getting rid of some of that shame just opens up that channel.
Yeah, that was a pathway for living.
Yeah.
I think it's important what you're saying, because very often we say the Sutton comes from before and after, but he doesn't come and tell us he's a Sutton. He comes dressed in holy garb and uses holy words. How could you? You're disappointing this person. You understand your ancestors. Whatever. It can really
Oh yeah.
destroy us with the beautiful language. It usually speaks in Hebrew and Yiddish, in my voice.
Yeah, mine is definitely Yiddish. So,
Right. Using a lot of this lingo. It's like
definitely.
chat. I was sitting with a young guy, I don't know, maybe 20, who was going through a lot in his life, like in his family life, and he sat down with me because he was struggling with porn, and you could see like the shame, like such shame. So I said to him, "Is it hard for you to tell me what you're saying?" And he said, "Yeah, I just feel like I'm such a bad person." I said, "But why are you telling me?" So, because I know you talk about it. I said, "Well, do you think I'm such a bad person?" I'm like, "Well, that's that." So I said, "Who's the voice? Is there someone like this voice that's killing you? Who's the voice?" So he mentioned a few, right? Few that he felt so bad, like they're disappointing. I said, "Listen, I don't know them. I don't know them well, and even if I did know them, they may not have shared this part of life with me. I guarantee you two things. They have money problems and they have sex problems, because everyone I've ever met has problems in those two arenas of life. These energies are too powerful for us humans to wield without getting burnt a little bit by so like just easy. And that's what you're saying with these mashpiyim. I certainly felt that. I think I felt very like it went to the Rebbe in some way, where he was projected as a perfect person. And I was like, what is the point? Like when I got older, I'm like, what utility is there for me to honor someone who was just perfect, had no work to do what he did? I said, okay, should I honor a machine which can stay on 24 hours a day? I get so excited. Computer, I never have to turn off this computer. This thing, you just charge it. Wow, amazing. So what's impressive about someone who couldn't sleep? Only if they were dealing with regular, in some way, some human experience. I understand their ideas, okay, comes in, a little bit different job, a little different reality. But if there wasn't some work, if there wasn't some struggle, if there wasn't something to overcome, then it wouldn't particularly be impressive. We'd have no reason to have that person in the front of the room.
I think they say about the Rebbe Marash, I believe it's the Rebbe Marash, that a chassid once came to him for his guidance, for his help. And the Rebbe Marash had sent him away because he couldn't help him. And the Rebbe Marash secluded himself in his room for the next few days, I think it was. And at some point he shared beyond that every time somebody comes asking for his help, he has to be able to identify, a chassid comes and he shares, he's struggling with money or with sex, you're talking about. So the Rebbe has to be able to identify something within himself on a small measure, on some kind of level, where he's able to identify with that chassid. And then he's able to help him.
Right. If he can't find the problem in him.
If he's completely removed, then he really isn't able to help that person. Because you have to, I think, again, it was maybe also the Rebbe Marash who used to change his clothing he used to perspire, he used to sweat terribly. And one of the attendants asked him, why are you sweating so much? And he said, do you know what it means that every time a chassid comes in, I have to undo my own garments? In other words, I have to free myself of myself, enter into that person, sort of live the experience with them. Then I have to extract myself, go back, become the Rebbe again, find the solution. So that's exhausting. That process is exhausting. So again, I think the Rebbe, and certainly those of us who had experiences with the Rebbe and those of us who are familiar, the Rebbe was never trying to overwhelm people with his greatness, holiness, purity. And the Rebbe certainly was great and pure and holy on a level, and I'm not an expert in that, but certainly the Rebbe was. But in terms of, and this is feedback not from my own experiences, but from people who interacted, with the Rebbe, and no matter who they were, where they were coming from, or what they were struggling with, they always felt that the Rebbe wasn't looking down on them, wasn't sitting up in his ivory tower and dispensing some kind of advice, but the Rebbe was in it with them. And that was really the Rebbe's strength. And again, this is kind of the same idea. I think that mashpiyim, spiritual mentors, rabbis, community leaders, children, or your students, or anybody that comes to you, they have to feel like, you find a way of being in it with them. You're saying it's easy enough to do that because most of us are not on the level of a Rebbe. Most of us have those struggles within ourselves, and just to let that person know that,
it doesn't need to be need to be exact, but on some level we can resonate. Like for example, I've spoken to people who've abused children. I have. So is it so far out there for me to imagine an uncontrollable sexual desire? Like to be so overwhelmed by sexual desire? How much porn have I watched? How many strip clubs have I been in? I understand this. I don't understand this specific. I haven't experienced this specific strain that this guy is talking about. Okay, fine, but in 90% of it, I get the feeling.
But you understand how this is something that if you don't hold on to the reins, it can take you anywhere very quickly.
Yeah. So the story you're saying, I think Yossi Jacobson shared it in a recent podcast I did with him. It may be the Mittler Rebbe he said the story about, but maybe the Rebbe Rash, I'm not sure. But he did continue the story, and he said that the chassid asked him. So the person who came to the Rebbe to actually talk about a sex problem. What was his problem? He's attracted to dead people. I think it's called necrophilia. Either he was thinking about it, obsessing, or actually did it, had sex with a dead human body. And when the person came to the Rebbe, whether it was the Marash or the Rebbe, he was almost the way Rabbi Jacobson shared it was almost like, oh my goodness, how could this problem be inside me? Because obviously if the person is coming to me for help, then this problem lives inside. So he went for a few days to find where this could be inside him, because he knew it was inside him. Because the person came for
Otherwise,
help.
the chassid wouldn't
have come for help.
Right.
So it wasn't only he had to find it inside him, was he knew it was inside him. And apparently, the way I think Rabbi Jacob shared the story, he was rolling around in his room. There was noise. There was things going on. And when he eventually came out and was able to call the person back, was able to help him, he explained what he found in himself. And he said, "What is it to sleep with a dead person? Is to be willing to take energy from something that has none, right? But being so desperate to." So desperate for energy that even something that's basically lifeless.
That's dead. Yeah.
So what Rabbi Jacobson shared about about this Rebbe was that he recognized that sometimes he's sitting and teaching, and the person on the other end is asleep.
Right.
But still he keeps talking.
Right. There's no life there.
There's no life, but he's still getting something from it. It's still giving him something. So he said on some level he found this.
Getting some satisfaction,
problem.
even though there's
right. The reason I love this
life.
story, to me, like this story is so antithetical to what I felt as a child, not to what maybe the message they were sending, but it's that here was someone who genuinely struggled, genuinely worked, and that's why he's sitting there. He's sitting there because he worked like when there was what is it, like finding chametz. He went searching for 3 days because he knew there's got to be a speck. He knew there's got to be a speck somewhere, and then he found it. And then he comes back and says, "Okay, now I have something to share with you. Look what I found." That's such a beautiful, that story, wakes you up. But someone who oh wow, he can work, 90 years straight without sleep. Okay, right. So could some computers.
Just to feel comfortable that when you share a struggle with another person, you don't feel judgment.
Right.
You feel their compassion. That's what people need.
I mean, when people are speaking to me and they share something that's incredibly shameful, I'm thinking of the guy I've been helping for a little while, and he was like, whoa, so down, so depressed. But he didn't tell me why. And eventually, after months of talking and different things, and there was, some financial difficulties that were going on that I helped out a little bit with. And eventually we were sitting together and he says to me, I kind of never share this with anyone, but maybe this will help explain why I am the way I am. And he shared a financial mistake that he had made. And he thought I was going to destroy him.
He was afraid of your judgment.
He was so afraid of it. And I said, listen, I haven't spoken so publicly about these things. And I know I wear very fancy shirts, right? Very expensive stuff. But this feeling that you're talking about, I said, I've had it. I know exactly. I know that feeling. I know that feeling of making horrible financial decisions one after the next, and being in a space where you're like, wow, I cannot believe I got here. I cannot believe I did these things. How foolish could I be? And it eased something in there where he shared something that was so difficult. Schneur, to get these words out of this guy, it was like his teeth were chattering. When he finally got it out, it was after months and a lot of there was a lot of safety that had to be created in order for him to finally share this. And really, as far as, yes, it was a very tough experience, and it created ramifications for others that were painful, and he has to bear the brunt of that pain. There's nothing to do with that. I can't absorb that. But the shame he felt, I'm the only idiot on the planet who ever made this mistake. Easy does it. And I was able to share an experience of my own, right, where.
And that gave him strength.
There was common ground. And the experience included the shame afterwards. Right, that I'd made a series of financial decisions, and I ended up in a very, very tough spot, and I just could not believe I was there. Could not believe I could have. A number of years ago, I was dealing with some very, very difficult financial stuff, knowing about it, and that was a series of mistakes, an incredible shame for those mistakes, and sharing those. Then we bonded over that, and I think for mashpiyim who are listening in, that's usually the move. That's usually the move when someone comes.
Be vulnerable.
Yeah, when someone comes, that's usually the move. When someone comes and says they've unburdened themselves something that's so shameful and so difficult, is if there's something we can find in ourselves, right, that's similar, and then share it with that person, the shame is gone.
Right. And it doesn't have to be, you don't have to share with him your deepest, darkest. You
No.
just have to be able to share something that allows that person
Yeah.
to feel what you're
Yeah.
describing. So, and maybe this is a message for people that are, God willing, listening and will be listening. We talked about the shame component of it, but also the idea that oftentimes coming clean, as we know, will interrupt the cycle, because that cycle continues, under the cover of dark.
Mhm.
The longer, the lie, as long as people don't know about it, and that's the space where it keeps festering and it keeps growing and you keep acting out again and again. But the moment that you expose it, it becomes a lot more difficult. That's another book that you shared with me, Positive Intelligence, where he talks about that a lot. But the idea that you go and you now, you sit down with somebody and you come clean, again, it has to be the right person. It has to be a
Right,
safe
because you're opening
environment,
yourself up in that
but
space.
it
So someone can add
interrupts,
shame.
it interrupts a process, especially, you're talking about porn addiction or sex addiction or others. And people who are married, they have spouses, they have children, people who are in positions of leadership, whether in terms of business or, Avodas HaKodesh, and so on. But as long as you keep that, as long as it's secret, you're going to suffer for another day and another day. The moment that you come clean and you shine a light on it, it has nowhere left to hide.
So I say sunlight is
So-
said to be the best disinfectant.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important for people to kind of find the courage. We, as a community, have to be able to provide them with the safe spaces, because they have to, every person has to come to that willingness that you talked about earlier.
Right.
You have to be willing to do it. And again, that's earlier on in the steps. You also have that, to have that willingness before you actually turn it over. You have to have the willingness. But you have, when a person is, that they have to come to on their own. But we as a community are trying to provide the safer spaces and sort of put the message out that, we're not going to judge you. You will find comfort here. You will find the support that you're looking for.
100%. What's interesting is I'm thinking that a lot of the spaces that are afforded to people often become things that instead of saying, okay, there's shame, let's become shameless, like the opposite, right? Like, let's throw it all out. And then they become judgment-free, sure, judgment-free zone, but then it also becomes a standard-free zone, which is not always good. So the risk for not creating a judgment-free zone is that you end up sending people to places which are judgment-free, but most of those spaces which are judgment-free are also standard-free. So it's like, okay, anything goes. We have no judgment here,
You're bringing up something that's very, very, very deep. And that's why, as a community, oftentimes we struggle. I was having this conversation with someone, talking about, this is one of the ongoing, conversations about what do we do with our children that are struggling, and different approaches. Some still argue that we have to be very firm with them, and others, I think, we talked about Rabbi Jacobson and Rabbi Russell, if you're familiar with him. But a lot of them say you got to show them love, unconditional love, and there's no judgment. There was, recently a tragedy that happened in the Belz community in Israel, where I guess a bacher, a young man, kind of left the fold, and his family shut him out, and eventually he committed suicide. This happened a few weeks ago. And the Belzer Rebbe was so shocked by what happened that he immediately called together community leaders, and he said, we are going to form a VAD, an organization that is going to reach out to every single one of these children who have left the fold. There will be no conditions whatsoever, no preconditions. Just reach out to them, show them love. There's no, you have to keep Shabbos, you have to wrap your tefillin. We just need to stay in touch with them, realizing the devastating impacts on shutting children out.
Yeah, it's huge.
But so this parent that reached out to me, who's kind of struggling with their own child, and we were talking about it, and he was trying to get my not that I am, a professional. I don't believe myself to be an authority, but I do have my own children, and I'm in the community, and I'm struggling with very much the same. But I think there has to be a balance. In other words, what you're saying is that if we create an environment that's, judgment-free, guilt-free, shame-free, standard-free, that's not the objective.
No.
Not that nothing
Sometimes
matters
you
anymore.
have to, like, that's a step up from
Right. In other words, if you have
a
somebody
shame-
who's suffering, if it's a mental health issue or it's an abuse issue or a trauma issue, so sometimes we have to focus on that first, right? Before we can, help that person.
Right. It's certainly a
Right.
step up, right? To have a zone with a ton of shame and then say, okay, here's a space without shame.
But how do you
Also
balance
has no
that? How do you
standard.
balance that?
I think the 12 steps does that fairly well, right?
Right.
Like we still have, standards within the meetings. We have certain principles that we adhere to. We're not putting you down. We're not saying you're a bad person if you don't, but there is in this space, there's a certain standard. But also, listen, there's a progression of things. And if someone is at that level of suicidal, then
We have to do that for the moment. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the long term obviously is to have a space with high standards, right? That's what we want for ourselves. That's what we want for the people we love is, we can do incredible things. Why have low standards?
Yeah, and I think that many of us are struggling with that at this point, because I think there are more spaces that are shame-free and guilt-free and maybe a bit to the extreme. And now many are wondering if, we're sort of giving our children a pass to say, well, these things are not really so important, but they are really very important to us.
Yeah, listen, when it comes to children, and my children are not as old as yours, my oldest is 5, but 5-year-olds go through difficult periods also, and 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds.
I think they say the terrible 2s, the horrible 3s, and then it just gets worse and worse. So,
Well, I can tell you without fail, at least with one of my children, when my wife and I are struggling a little bit more, he becomes a little terrorist.
he knows it. He feels it.
He feels it. He feels it 100%. And I think my wife and I do a better job of that now, where it won't go more than 3 or 4 days of him just acting difficult, where we won't look at each other and say, hey, there's something, the answer is here. And that's, with a lot of these families. So you're telling me that this family, this Belzer family, which had a kid who left the fold and committed suicide, left the fold and was rejected and committed suicide. So the kid had 100% of the issues in the family and the parents had none? They were.
Well, I always think about a letter. I don't remember all the details of it, but somebody had shared with me a letter, the Rebbe's response to, I guess, parents that had reached out to the Rebbe about a child of theirs that were struggling, with Yiddishkeit, with observance, and they were asking the Rebbe for advice. And the Rebbe actually lists a number of things, very interesting. One of the things the Rebbe says is to try to find a contemporary of his, a good friend, to be a positive influence. The Rebbe lists a number of things, and at the end, the Rebbe basically tells the parents that they have to check their own Yiddishkeit. In other words, the Rebbe is kind of saying that what we see happening in our children oftentimes are it's a bit of a reflection.
Not a bit.
Of what's happening. I don't want to put all of it there because there could be children that have picked up struggles outside of the home. You want to talk about it didn't begin with me. You want to talk about attachment or all of the IFS or so on. So there are many layers here, but certainly things that are showing up in your children's lives and things that they're struggling with are indicators of what's happening in our lives. And certainly you and I both know that as we get healthier as parents, and I know for myself and Devorah, as we get healthier as parents, immediately we see that in our children. We see those positive.
Correct.
We see it in our children, for
100%,
sure.
100%.
Just like they talk about in recovery, right? If you don't interrupt the process, then basically what you do is you pass these things along to your children.
100%.
Not only will you suffer what your parents suffered, but if you don't put a stop to it, if you don't heal, then you are going to gift that, and I mean that quote unquote.
Yeah, you kind of leave the unfinished business
legacy.
to them.
That's it. You leave the legacy to your children. So the healthier we get, the healthier our children get. So yes, our children really are mirrors, and The Baal Shem Tov said that, not even, the Baal Shem Tov said that generally,
everyone.
yeah, that if you identify something in another person for whatever reason, if you feel, immediately you feel the sense of judgment, then that's something that you are struggling with.
Right.
You got to check yourself on that.
Even more so with
Yeah.
our kids. Also with our kids, it's, we're creating the soup that they're swimming in.
Right.
This relationship therapist my wife and I went to said, the space between the couple is the playground for the children, right? So what is in that space? Is it harshness? Is it impatience? Is it anger? Is it resentment? Then that's the playground.
Well,
so
you
of
think
course
you're
they get
fighting once your
sick.
kids are sleeping, but it doesn't matter.
Right, no, it
They
doesn't
will know
matter.
it.
No, they know.
I remember
Vacuum cleaners.
Chaim Drizzen, who's a therapist and a clinician. So
Yeah.
years and years ago, we invited him to our Chabad house, and he did a little couples, workshop. And so he challenged everybody, and he said, "Okay, take your time, divide your time. So you've got, however many hours you're at work. Okay, what's the balance? What time do you have left?" He says, "Tell me something. If you had to divide that time between your spouse and your children, how would you divide it?" So most of us,
Yeah, 95.
you think to yourself, "Oh, I'm going to give 95% of the time, my focus, my attention, my love to my children, whatever's left. When I get into the bedroom after the long day and after I put my kids to bed and everything else, whatever's left, I give to my wife." And he says, "Actually not. Because the energy, and I'll say it in this way, but whatever you invest in your spouse, your children are going to benefit from that. But what you invest in your children, you could be the best father and she could be the best mother, but your relationship doesn't benefit from that."
Right.
So the children will benefit most if you have a great relationship. So I know, like with my kids, we made a point of trying to get out, whether it was once a week or whatever, spending time together, or taking little, staycations together. And sometimes the kids will complain, "Oh, you're going away again?" But now, as they're a little older, they appreciate that we were investing in each other, and they benefited from it
Right.
as children.
A friend of mine, older friend of mine, told me, he said, the greatest gift I gave to my kids was treating their mother well.
MS.
So may I learn from him.
Yeah. May we all learn from
May I
him,
learn
right?
from him. I was just
Yeah.
thinking of, okay, it'll come to me. But there was a therapist speaking to, his name is Mark Brenner in California, and he said that he told me, with sometimes when he's I think fairly well known as someone who's able to get through to people who are difficult to get through to people. Okay, and I think he's been coined the family whisperer. I don't know by himself or by others, but he has a very good way with children and a way of connecting and relating to them. And one time in talking to him, he said that some people he's not able to get through to. So he says in those cases, he just waits for their kids to grow up. He says, and then they'll see all their problems right there.
Will show up in their children.
Will show up in their kids. And then, those who are a little bit more honest will say, "Oh, wow, like this is my creation. It's literally our creation. It's, we set up everything for these kids, and then we blame them when they're having a hard day. It's what's wrong with you? What do you mean what's wrong? You raised them, you nurtured them, you clothed them, you bathed them, you fed them. Like the whole world you created. You want to know what's wrong with that? What's wrong?
Sometimes we don't make the connection. We always repeat that story, and I think it's from Rabbi Schneur Kaplan. If you want to, when I was younger, I thought I could change the world, right? Change yourself, and eventually the world will change around you. And oftentimes we don't make that connection in our own little world. The world of
Right.
our own home and our children. The healthier we get, the healthier our children are going to get, period. Like you said before, the greatest gift you can give your children is treating your spouse well, treating your wife well. So, and that's a wonderful thing that we've seen. There's certainly a lot more awareness today than there was when we were growing up. And there's help available. There's less shame, going to therapy. Today, that's become something that's accepted, even celebrated, encouraged. Maybe years ago it wasn't. And so maybe people hesitated going into therapy because they were worried about the shame and guilt that would be, the stigma that was associated with it. So there's a lot more of that kind of awareness that's happening in mental health and so on. And we are beginning to realize that we need to make these important changes. This is how we are going to change the world. We need to give our children that gift.
Right. Not saddle them with our problems to fix.
Yeah, and
Each one of us are born
thank
with our
God in
own.
the Jewish community, the Jewish psyche, we have so many layers and layers of trauma and high cortisol levels, and it didn't begin with me and all that kind of stuff that we're already gifting our children, and that's stuff that I'm just passing it along. It's not nothing that I am directly responsible for, things that didn't even happen in my lifetime. I'm just passing them. I received them from my parents. They got them from their parents. It's part of the tradition.
Yeah.
These traumas, as a psyche, but we have to interrupt those things.
I say break the chain.
Break the chain. Sometimes people say, well, it's not my responsibility because that's coming from generation before. Well, now it is yours. It's like the Rebbe used to say, Kol mi sheli nivne beis hamikdash biyamav. A person who, if the Beis Hamikdash is not rebuilt in your day, it's as if it was destroyed in your day. So I say that's got nothing to do with me. It happened to thousands of years ago. It's not my sins, right? Because, and why? So the Rebbe would say, "Well, how could you put that responsibility on me? I wasn't even around." So the Rebbe would say, "Well, because if you have the ability to interrupt or change something and you don't do it, right now it becomes your responsibility. So as parents, I could blame whichever generation I want to, but now I'm the father. And if I don't take responsibility for that, for something that I didn't even do, it doesn't matter."
Right. Your kid is not dragging his grandfather into therapy.
Exactly.
He's dragging you into
So
therapy.
if I don't do it, if I don't heal, I will pass it along. It will linger for one more.
Right. I guess that's what it means to become an adult.
Yeah, that's taking responsibility, becoming a.
Right.
I was just sharing with another delicate story. I can't share all the details, but a woman was sharing something with me, and something that she's been struggling to resolve, something she's been carrying, but it's not her burden. It was her parents' burden. They never resolved it. Now it becomes her burden. And I said to her, and she's telling me, well, I don't know if I want to put it on my kids. Maybe I just won't say anything about it. And I said, remember something. You don't resolve it now, then you're leaving it. Your children will suffer the same thing you're suffering a whole life. Your children are going to suffer. So you need to have the courage to interrupt it. And like you're saying, it's going to show up in your children, whether you like it or not. Even if you make sure that all the kids are asleep, or you never unlock that closet, or you never breathe a word, your children will suffer.
Now, when you get close enough to a family, you start seeing the pattern. It's sometimes hard to see in our own family, so we can look at our in-laws for it. Sometimes it's a little bit easier because it's a family we get close to, but we're not as part of it. And you can see things that
from generation to generation.
Yeah, you just see it just happens, and obviously it happens in each of our families as well, right? That just things that.
I can tell you from my own personal life, if there was anything that I'd ever worked on, I could immediately see changes in my children, and I wouldn't have to say anything to them.
So here's
the
the million-dollar question,
Yeah.
right? That's for sure, right? That the changes will change your children. Will the changes in you change your parents? Does it go upstream?
I believe not in a direct way, but I believe in an indirect way. And again, there are parts of my story that are sensitive, and I have to be considerate and so on. My parents are amazing people, my father you certainly know, and my mother. But I believe that when children are doing their own work and they are reaching, greater states of awareness and enlightenment and introducing, they go back and share with their parents in a very gentle way, because remember that, our parents could be sensitive, but if we share with them in a gentle way and they see the progress that we are making, then I think it might help them as well. So I think it could travel upstream, but it's a little bit more difficult. There's a lot more, resistance, and it's not sort of the direct path, because the change that a child makes, I don't believe will automatically impact a parent. It will certainly automatically impact the child. But I think our parents who are in touch with us and see the progress that we're making, I think it inspires them. It inspires them, yeah.
What do you make of the fact that it's only in the last 10 years that these things have become part of the conversation? But now they almost feel to me, they almost feel like the bedrock of life. Like I don't have another framework for living day to day than this one. It feels to me like the bedrock even of Judaism and spirituality. Like, what is all of that if it's not this personal growth? And yes, we may use, psychological language to talk about these terms, but it seems from this conversation that this is a day-to-day reality and checkpoint in your life, as it is in mine, these kind of ideas. What do you make of the fact that 10 years ago they almost weren't there at all?
Look, I don't know. I'm sure that there are people who can do a proper study and analyze the psyche and what we went through and what we suffered through. But my experience with Chassidus, right? I'm looking at Chassidus today, and I see it differently as a grown-up than, I guess you begin to appreciate it more and more. But I look at Chassidus and I say to myself,
it's like watching a Disney movie as a kid.
Yeah, but
like that's what the story was.
Right,
You watch it as adults.
I don't remember when it was. I was putting, my son to sleep, and in his room he has Sichos in English has the biographies of the Rebes in English, and it's an easy read. It's made for, I guess, teenagers or children. So I'm lying there with my son, so I pick them up and I start reading through them. The Chassidus there's so much self-awareness in Chassidus, right? The early Chassidim, they certainly believed that, this was the only path. I don't know where it was interrupted or somehow how that wasn't communicated properly to us. But, spend time learning the Rebbe Rashab's Ma'amarim. This is someone who had profound self-awareness. I mean, incredible. And I guess what Chassidus is arguing is that you can't really make you're not going to evolve if you don't have this kind of self-awareness. So I don't know where it was interrupted, but I think that this was the gift that the Alter Rebbe gave us, and this was the gift of Chassidus. And there are, generations of this tradition. It wasn't necessarily communicated to me, again, in my personal experience from some of the spiritual mentors that I had. So I don't know where this has come from.
Right. Earlier you were saying about the Beis Hamikdash, right? That whoever hasn't built the temple, their days as if they destroyed it. Obviously, there's a concept that there's the inner temple as well that we're responsible for, perhaps more responsible for. Right. Meaning there's certainly we can say that about our own inner temple, and how do we build that unless we degrease it a little bit?
Chabad Chassidus is calling us to that work, because otherwise you have a Shulchan Aruch, and the Shulchan Aruch, tells you the do's and the don'ts. And so the Shulchan Aruch very much deals with a person as a behavioral creature, but there's a whole inner world that's underneath it. And Chassidus calls us into that important work. I don't see how somebody could be working the program of Chassidus and not, consider all of these things.
That's kind of, maybe that's another way of asking the same question, is it seems to be so much a part of the conversation in the last 10 years, but how was it understood 20, 30 years ago?
It's a good question.
What was the framework for this?
It's like, there's Ayem Yem, it comes from the Tzemach Tzedek, and I don't remember it off by heart, but that Tzemach Tzedek is basically saying that the daven, to have it easy in your spiritual work, that would be inappropriate. We don't do that.
Right.
On the contrary, he says, it's almost, and I'm of course paraphrasing, it's almost like you say, bring it on. I want more of this, because I understand that this struggle and this hard work, that's where I find my liberation, right? That's where I discover the true self, the higher self.
I think it's a Bruce Lee quote. Don't pray for an easy life, pray for the...
And that's effectively what the Tzemach Tzedek is saying, but he says it in
Right.
his own beautiful words.
Right.
But that's the idea. Chassidus talks about Avodah B'Keach Atzmai, not to look for an easy pass, but to work. It's in that work. It's in that struggle.
Right, and really that inner...
it's in that struggle.
Inner work.
My example that I always like to use, and I was talking about it this morning, because in Tanya we're learning Igeres HaTshuva now. We're talking about Tshuva. So I always talk to them about I use the example of the personal trainer.
Right.
Why is it that the righteous would always welcome the suffering of this world. It says that the righteous would welcome the suffering of this world because they would understand that suffering as God showing them love. Because suffering of this world helps to, purge the stain of sin. It helps, people evolve, right? I was talking about it with Tyler when I came to the front door, right? To be comfortable and routine doesn't help me much, right?
We need the ice cold water.
Yeah, the ice cold water, right? The ice bath that we took, which, by the way, I'm still, my body is still, I'm still feeling it.
Told you, I saw this.
It's like a positive buzz, you know?
Yeah.
But so we were talking about God as the personal trainer. If you're getting ignored, right? If you're foolish, you think, oh, he loves me so much, he's just, he leaves me alone today. And somebody says to you, he's such a fool. He leaves you alone today because he doesn't believe you have anything more to give. Because if he felt that you have something more to give, he'd be pushing you, he'd be driving you, right? You walk into a gym and you see,
he's giving you a little
this
chofish.
trainer beating somebody up. You say, hey, what are you, stop that. You don't have the perspective, right? Meanwhile, this guy's getting paid. I'm paying him to beat me up. Why? Because I understand what he's doing for me. And so with God, it's kind of it's the same thing.
Right.
So again,
but
I don't know
a good
what the
trainer
answer,
knows how to get maximum results with minimum.
Yeah. So I don't know why we didn't have this awareness before. Maybe some people did, or where that communication was lost. But certainly when you read, early Chassidus.
Yeah, it's almost hard to read
you read everything that the Rebbe wrote and everything that the Rebbe was pushing for. It's always been there. It's always been there, and somehow, we've missed it. And I'm glad that we're coming back to that awareness, and that we find that oftentimes people who are looking, sometimes like the famous story of the guy who's looking for the treasure, and he travels to Prague because he has the dream. It's under the bridge in Prague, and he gets there, and he's told, the captain of the guard says to him, oh, you have that dream? I have a dream that there's a treasure buried, and he tells him his address, and he runs back home. But oftentimes before we discover the treasure that's buried in our own home, in our own community, in our own, Chassidus, we're out there looking, for other things. And there are incredible therapies that are out there. You were talking about IFS and attachment styles and EMDR and psychedelics. And I mean, there's a whole world of therapies that's out there.
Right.
And oftentimes we kind of, turn our back on whether it's Chassidus or Yiddishkeit because we feel like it has nothing to offer us. And then we find some other therapy that seems to give us relief or give us direction or help us with healing. And then I hope that people will, take a second look at our tradition and realize that it's an incredible wellspring. And I'm not saying that, Chassidus can heal all things. Again, I'm not a mashpia, and people have asked this question. Does Tanya have the answer to every question? And so on. And Tanya certainly does have the answer, like Torah has the answer to every question, and Tanya has the remedy for any and every ailment, and so on. Sometimes you need the right person to help you discover it, but certainly these therapies are incredibly powerful and incredibly helpful. And then we go back and we realize, wow, you go back and you learn Tanya. If you're somebody who struggled with depression, I'm not talking about clinical depression, right? And you go back to Tanya, where the Alter Rebbe addresses it, Perek Chavav. It's like, this is unbelievable. It's like I've said this for years and years in Chitas, and I never realized how powerful, what the Alter Rebbe was saying here. So there is incredible power there.
Well, while you were talking, you reminded me of something I was going to say and forgot.
Yeah.
But in terms of finding something and reconnecting, so a lot of ways that book you gave by Shays Taub did that for me, where I found all these wonderful beauty within the 12 steps. And then he's like, here, look where it is within Judaism. So in that book, Out of Our Understanding, he talks about the rebellious child, the story of the rebellious child in the Torah, the Ben Sorah Umar.
Yeah.
And he quotes it in the original text. And it says something, when it's introducing the rebellious child, it says, and if there is a man or a boy who does not listen to the voice of his father and the voice of his mother.
Einenu shomea b'kol aviv, yeah.
Uv'kol imay.
Yeah.
So what Shay says is that it's telling you, I don't know where he got this, I don't know if it's his line or he's quoting it for someone else. is that it's telling you exactly how a rebellious child is formed. That he doesn't listen to the voice of his father and the voice of his mother, because they're two separate they're two distinct
Right.
voices. If they're one voice, then the rebellious child never happens. So, one of the many ways that the parents, we create the environment for
healthy children.
Yeah, and when they're not,
A dysfunctional relationship will produce dysfunctional children. A healthy relationship will produce healthy children. And again,
and for it to have a
yeah,
healthy relationship, you have to have healthy individuals as well. So
right. It's like the importance of, and I see you have a book downstairs about power versus
force.
Power versus force. Okay, and Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Alav Shalom, talks about the difference between power and influence. The office of the
Right.
king who has power, and the office of the prophet who has influence. He doesn't have any power, but he has this incredible influence, and he talks about the importance. And the Rebbe certainly talked about this, not to exercise power over children, and especially in areas of Yiddishkeit. And generally that expresses itself in, you have to, you better, versus the idea of influence, which predominantly influence is setting the right example. Don't lecture your children about davening or saying their brachas.
There's a story, a parable or whatever, about some king who comes to, or a parth, let's say, right, who comes to a rabbi in city, and he's talking about how powerful he is. So the rabbi says, actually, this way is more powerful. He says, if you give my people a pass for anything going wrong, I'll prove it to you. So it was the Passover of Pesach. So he said, I want you to go home, someone, and bring me a piece of bread. Someone, please, I'm asking you, to bring me a piece of hummus. And for hours, people are searching and searching and searching and searching, and they come back with nothing. They say, Rabbi, I know you want us to bring. It's obviously important the parts is here, but I don't have anything. We can't. We've turned over the whole city. We can't find one piece of bread. So he says, okay, now I want you to go back and bring any contraband. Anything illegal. Anything they have illegal in the city, right? Go back and bring it, right? And obviously he has a pass from the parts, so no one's going to get in trouble for this. And everything starts coming, right? The fake IDs, whatever it is, right?
In a second.
All these things start coming out. He says, you see, you have power. Right?
Reb Levi Yitzchak, the story is Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev. Yeah,
Okay.
he took his shamas on Erev Pesach, and he sent him to the market to go get chametz. And the shamas looked at him like, what are you talking about? He says, I'm telling you, go and find me chametz. And of course, he went out and he couldn't find any chametz no matter how much he offered. And then he said to him, okay, go out and get me the illegal tobacco or whatever it was. And again, he looked at Reb Levi Yitzchak like, anyway, he ran and he was able to find it very, very quickly. And Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, he looked up and he said to Hashem, look at this, you have, the Tsar has police standing on every street corner, and this drug is illegal, and in 30 seconds, my shamas can buy some. You, thousands of years ago, you gave this prohibition about not eating chametz, and you have no police standing on the streets, and yet I can't find any chametz. So he used that as a...
As a good...
making.
But it's a difference between, like you said, power and influence.
That's it. So we have to try and be the right influence for our children. And that goes back to what we were talking about before, is because, many of us parents are lecturing our children about how they need to get healthy or the work that they need to do or the things that they need to fix. And that's trying to use power, and it doesn't work.
Right.
And the children don't hear it.
It's trying to use power, and oftentimes it's trying to avoid
our own
work.
But if we will set the proper example, whether it's in areas of Yiddishkeit or getting healthier, then immediately we will influence our children.
I remember speaking to a parent who had a child and very addicted to drugs, and they were telling me, I have to convince my children to go to get into rehab. Can you help me convince my children to get into rehab? And this individual happened not to be very physically healthy. So I said, are you taking care of yourself? I said, no, I can't. I have to, whatever.
Kids,
worry about this,
worry
my
about
kids,
the kids.
it's everything else. So I said, okay, so you're telling them to do something that's different than you're doing. Maybe if you prioritize your own healing and you show them that I'm going to put this first, despite all the reasons that I may have to avoid it. There's my kid who's sick, there's someone else, but at the end of the day, is our own healing our responsibility or not? And if it is, in this case was physical healing, right, which probably is also spiritual healing, like I think the Friedrich Rebbe says, right? The small hole in the body
Little
is a big hole in the
body,
soul.
yeah.
A little hole, yeah, small hole in the body is a big hole in the soul. So there was a small hole in the body in this case, for sure. And I encouraged him a few times. I said, check yourself in to doctors, go for whatever it is, whatever you need to heal yourself physically. And then the message will be sent that we prioritize our own healing. We take care of the healing that we need. But as long as you're telling them to do something that you're not doing, should they follow what you say and not what you do? That doesn't.
Yeah, I feel like that's
can
one
happen.
of the most important things as parents. As parents in chinuch, in educating our children.
Right.
Yeah,
I mean, this goes beyond. I guess that it's symbolic. This idea of kicking a kid out of yeshiva, like
right.
this.
That's a whole. That would be opening a Pandora's box.
Yeah, but it's the same idea. It's
but
the
I
same
think we've made a
concept.
lot of progress from there as well.
In fact, I ended up in Montreal yeshiva.
Yeah.
Because I was in yeshiva in Miami and I got kicked out, and I called to come back to Montreal, and Rabbi Wenger said, "I'll take responsibility. Like I'll get you
Right.
back in." I said, "Sorry," but what he said to me is, "I'll make sure you get in."
Yeah.
But being that I hadn't followed the rules of what we're supposed to do over the summer, so he said, "I want you to try a couple other schools, but you have a place here." So I guess in some way our relationship formed. So I ended up not going back that year to Montreal, but then I went back the next year, and there's definitely a fondness that I have for the yeshiva, and they had reasons on many occasions to
Listen, I remember
kick me out.
I remember my father, and it was one year that I was in Montreal. And, one of the boys was basically completely checked out, and we know, back then the worst crime in the world was watching movies in your
Right.
room or going to the movies, or talking to girls. But he was doing those things. And I remember at a certain point, I was sitting with my father, we were talking, and I said, well, why do you keep this boy in yeshiva? I mean, because I guess I wasn't exposing him to my father, but it was understood that my father
Yeah.
knew what he was up to. And I said, well, why do you keep him in yeshiva? So my father said, listen, my policy is that so long as he is not poisoning the environment around him, right? In other words, taking other students with him or, generating... He said, as long as he's not poisoning the environment around him, I will keep him in yeshiva, because at least if I keep him here, there will be some benefit. Maybe he'll, grab a shachris, or maybe it's the benefit just knowing that it won't turn out to be worse. So, and I thought that was a very sound, policy. Whereas in other yeshivas, if you weren't, following.
Right.
If you weren't living up to the expectations, you were out. They caught you
Right.
talking to a girl or smoking a cigarette, you were out. And even if you were keeping it to yourself and you weren't hurting anybody else, they weren't thinking about the consequences of throwing somebody out on the street.
Right. Even that one is subject to interpretation. Exactly when
Right.
it's.
So, but I think we have made
We've
progress there.
Yeah.
With that.
I think where we made progress is that now there are schools that are options.
Right.
To go to, so kids
Right. There has
don't need to go to a school that they would
there
get
have to
kicked
be
out.
those
These
schools
only
as well, but I think also some of the mainstream schools are also a little bit more flexible, or reasonable. It's not like, okay, you're out.
Right.
So
what I was saying
there will
is
be
that in
some
many ways,
consideration.
our relationship was formed over that. Because Montreal,
Yeah.
when I came to Miami, I didn't last 3 weeks. I read a non-Jewish book. They kicked me out of school.
Right.
So I read a non-Jewish book. That's why I said that it's subject to interpretation. I read a non-Jewish book, and I loaned it to a friend.
Ah, okay.
So then they said I'm a sinner who's making others sin.
Woohoo.
Well, okay. The guy had me in a headlock to take the book from me.
Right.
No, okay. So,
Or maybe you didn't
I'm saying
realize
that's why
you
it's
didn't
subject
think it was something so terrible, so you shared it. Who knows? Yeah, but that is definitely how we met on that level.
right. And so I'm saying another yeshiva did kick me out. Montreal didn't. So there were other kids who did get kicked out. There were things that I did that they knew about that other kids had gotten kicked out for. But for whatever reason,
So in other words, our relationship is many, many things.
right. But one of them is
I think one of the most important things is the idea of reaching out and understanding that, today there are communities that are out there that will give you the support that you need and give you the strength that you need. And as you talked about before, the importance of, getting over that shame, And that's a very big part of, I think, what both of us have been doing. is trying to make ourselves available to help others. And what I've been talking about, we certainly evolve and so on, but something that I've been repeating, I catch myself repeating it over and over and over again, and I've shared it with you, and I've read, probably some of the same books that you've read, but this idea that whatever remains unresolved in our own lives, we will be passing it along to our children.
Unfortunately.
But fortunately, we've decided not to do that. And so we're making changes. And I think that there's a whole movement and a whole community of people that are not satisfied with doing that. And I think as a community, we are changing and evolving. And that becomes very, very, very powerful. So the message to everyone that's listening is to encourage them to find that willingness.
Yeah, I wish this could be, I think we should dive in a little bit, and then we can kind of wrap up this discussion on what it actually means when we say that something unresolved in us is going to be passed on to children. So I shared it in an earlier podcast. The podcast was called Our Most Sacred Responsibility. I shared it it was me and Ryan were talking, and I shared an example there. I shared a couple of examples, but the one example which I'll share now was of knowing several generations of a family where the oldest, right, the grandmother, so say grandmother, daughter, granddaughter, right? So the grandmother was forced to go to work at a very young age. But her mother never appreciated the fact that, at 11 years old, 12 years old, she was out there having to support the family. So she had this resentment towards her mother of, I worked my tail off and you didn't appreciate it. And I don't know how far it goes because I don't know. And then changed one variable in the relationship with her daughter where she didn't have to actually go get a job young, but maybe she had to parent one of the other kids young, right? So it's like, okay.
Because her mother was out working. Maybe.
Whatever it was.
Yeah.
But meaning she was forced, successively, all three generations were forced at a very young age to adult and to take on responsibility. But in one case, it was the responsibility of financial responsibility for the house, going at a job. In another case, it was responsibility of taking care of the younger siblings, but real responsibility for the younger siblings. At 12 years old, putting the 6-year-old to sleep. How come they're not at bedtime? Like that, like motherly responsibility. And then the next generation, it was responsibility for oneself, right? Like, okay, you have to take care, living on their own and stuff like that. And what was so interesting to me in seeing this is in each case, one variable changed, which was, working or not working, or, for money, for were you taking care of others, just taking care of yourself. One variable changed. And in each one, it led to the mother putting the child to work in very extreme ways, like adulting at a very young age, but not appreciating it in their child. And then the child developing a resentment
back
towards their mother that my mother, I worked so hard and my mother didn't even appreciate me. So each one feels the same way. And then watching this and just knowing with 100% certainty that this youngest one, right, who doesn't have a child yet, if she doesn't work out her resentment to her mother for this, then she will do it to her child. She'll change a variable, force her to grow up at a very young age, not appreciate her because it wasn't as hard as her life was, and the child will feel the exact same way. Unappreciated, overworked, and underpaid.
But the Torah says it also, by the way. When the Torah talks about the consequences of sin and how it passes along from generation to generation. Yeah, but it only says if the children don't interrupt that cycle, that behavior. In other words, it's almost as if prophetically the Torah is saying that if we don't interrupt it, it's going to continue. The mistakes of our parents will then show up in the next generation, and it won't be interrupted until we disrupt it. It's almost as if the Torah is saying that, right?
Where does it say it? What does it say?
Mashalom Gumul. So something positive goes on, le'elif there for 1,000 generation, but the consequences of the sin and the retribution goes 3 generations or 4 generations. But the exception to that is only if the children don't do tshuva. right? If they don't repeat
Right.
the behavior of their parents. But
Right.
it's almost
100%.
like, it's like
Yeah.
the self-fulfilling prophecy,
And,
right?
yeah, there's so many. There was someone who beating himself up for years about making significant financial mistakes, and then seeing their children the same thing, like never having healed that guilt and the shame over that thing, and how their child almost like a karma, like they're destined.
Right.
They've been
But to me, it's fascinating, though, because there are things, again, speaking about my own life, but there are things that I have dealt with, that I've worked on in my own life, that my children would have nothing, they don't even know about it.
right.
And I start to see changes in them, and I'm like, how could this be happening? They don't even know.
Right.
And they probably don't even realize, why these things are changing for them. But I'm telling you that I see it.
Yeah,
I can't explain it, but I see it. It's like what you're talking about your son, right? Your son can, if the energy between you and your wife is not right, he starts acting out.
100%.
How did he know? He didn't get a memo. Somehow he knows.
So I know.
Not because of anything he heard.
No,
There's,
and
a,
the
there's a
most-
field of energy that our children.
It's
are
like the woman
affected
says,
by
the playground of
Yeah.
the children
Yeah.
is the space between the parents.
Recently, I did some work, and recently I did some very serious work on a certain issue. And one of my children called me 2 or 3 days later and blew my mind. Like they came into this awareness as if out of nowhere, and something that he had been struggling with for a very, very long time. And I said, this is the gift.
Yeah.
This is the gift.
There's a gift. It is the blessing and the curse, right there.
It is, yeah.
I'll say one more thing,
Yeah.
and then we'll wrap up. So I made a comment about Disney before, and I know the way people like about Disney movies, that there's
Yes.
a lot in Disney movies. But as kids, we watch a Disney movie,
We didn't understand.
and we
it.
didn't
There was-
understand
there
it. We
was
watched it as
depth,
adult, and
layers
it's like
of
real
depth,
depth.
yeah.
So I was comparing it to
Yeah.
Chassidus, which I know you're supposed to say something when you do
Lahavdil.
Lahavdil.
Yeah, yeah.
So there was
With many, many distinctions.
when
yeah.
I was saying it, I was thinking about which Disney movie I'm referring to. So, and which one might have like a profound lesson. So, Lion King, you have, what does Scar do, right? Scar is like the right, the uncle of the king, right? So you have the king, Mufasa, kid, I forget his name, Simba, and then the uncle is Scar,
The evil uncle.
the evil uncle. So he's like the Yetzer Hara. So what does he do? He tempts him into, going into the gorge over there, and then his father gets stampeded and killed. And then what do you say? It's your fault. Right?
That's the
the
Satan
guilt,
milfanenu
right.
me'achrenu.
Right. First, he tempts him to come. We're going to see something. I forget exactly what they're going to see. He starts a stampede of the cows or whatever it was, right? They come running out, maybe the buffalo or the wildebeest, right? Come running down. The father tries to save the kid. He gets killed. And then he says, oh, look, you killed your father. So because of the guilt, he basically banishes himself to exile.
Right, that's why he doesn't go back.
Right, that's like, go back. And then eventually here's a calling, like, you're okay, remember who you are. And then, so who pays the price? Everyone. Right? All of his people are paying the price
The whole kingdom.
of his guilt. The whole kingdom is paying the price of his guilt, right? And shame. So the father was kind of not replaceable. He was meant to replace the father, right? If it was not now, it was later. Like,
Right.
that was his
The king
destiny.
was getting older already at some
Exactly,
point.
right? That was his destiny. He was going to be there, and everything would have been fine, if not for the guilt. And the guilt, like, banished him to exile. And then, in overcoming that guilt and overcoming that shame, he was able to reclaim his status as king, and then bring back healing and light and plenty to the.
I think the movie
to everyone.
ends where everything blossoms and
Right,
prospers.
because he comes back home.
Right, he comes back
Right,
home.
and if there's one scene in it
Yeah.
where he has a vision of his father, and he's saying, "Remember who you are. Remember who you
Right.
are. Like, don't let this guilt, don't define yourself by this one thing." And in some cases, in that case, it wasn't his fault. It was the uncle's fault. Fine, whatever. But the feeling is the same. The feeling is one of guilt that made him run away and play with monkeys and pigs and whatever else.
Right.
Right, just fooling around. And sometimes
supposed to
having
be
fun a little
royalty
bit. But he's
and-
right. He's supposed to, step into his role, and it was the guilt and shame that was holding him back. So may this podcast, this discussion, help to abolish any of the things that are keeping us out in
Amen.
the fields and the kingdom from flourishing, so we
You-
can all come back home.
In other words, what we say to ourselves and what we share with others, that message that he heard from his father, right? There's too much worthiness and godliness and holiness and purity inside of us to allow the shame and guilt to eclipse it.
Rabba Munasecha.
That's it. In other words, every one of us is
Right.
royalty.
Right.
So
Right. All of us have a very.
We got to find and I'm not to find the courage to confront your shame is sometimes seems to be unsurmountable. Insurmountable,
yeah.
right? But that's the way it always is. When you're looking at it, when you look at that mountain as it's coming up, you're thinking there's no way I'm going to climb that thing, right? But eventually, when you're looking in hindsight, once you've made it to the peak and you look back, it wasn't as difficult.
I know. You know what I tell people?
As you had anticipated.
The analogy I use, I say, imagine like black water. So you look at it, you think it goes on forever. If you try to dip your toe in, you will not have stepped in enough to know that the bottom is not so far. But as soon as you step in, you find out it's like 3 inches deep. It looks like it's forever, but it doesn't. You go in, and it's like, oh wow, it's released. Like
right now the work is going to be 3 minutes. Okay, that's my work.
It's not black water. That's a different.
Right.
Nice,
exactly.
crisp, clean water.
Exactly.
So, meaning the mountain suggests that there is like this massive thing in front of us. This little, it's a several inch pool, but it's black, so it looks like it goes forever.
And find the community of people who are like-minded. Thank God we have little pockets of them, pretty much everywhere.
Yes.
So go there. That's a good start. Go there.
Who is it who said that this whole life is a process of us walking each other home? So yes, there are many people trying to walk home and are willing and able to walk others who are willing to.
They certainly are.
As well. And I had such a cool experience recently where someone who reached out to me years ago, it was I can't tell you if he was suicidal or not, but I can tell you that when I got off the phone with him, I immediately called someone in the city and I said, can you go and meet with him because I'm concerned about him? And I put them together. That's where, like our first real phone call, that's where he was. And in the last few weeks, he had the opportunity to help me with something, like a healing thing. Like he was able to help me overcome something. And it was such a cool feeling to see how, like I told it to him, he said, thank you so much. You've been such an important part of my life. And I said, well, look how it repays, because I needed something and he
was there for you.
He was the medicine.
Now imagine what that does for him. The feeling that, once upon a time he was so desperate and so helpless that he didn't think anybody could help him. He was lost. And now he can be there for you.
Right. Well, at this point he knows he's helping many people. God bless. So he knows. It wasn't that. Right. It wasn't that for him.
Godless.
But it was a repayment back to me.
Right.
It was the guy who gave a loan to, and many years later, oh, by the way, I have some. So who did you give it to? You gave it back to yourself. Let's get working. But it's fun.
Well, Eli will continue to work. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you for being.
God willing, more will follow.
Yes.
Thank you, Tyler. It's a pleasure.
Beautiful. Likewise.
Yeah. Now I know what the loft is.
They were.
Yeah. No, I've watched some of the podcasts, but I didn't know where it was happening.
And you've been here, but you've never been upstairs.
Right, I've never been up
space.
here. Okay, every space has its
every space has its space.
Yeah, beautiful, Eli. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.